All right, today we're basically becoming historical detectives. We've got our hands on these two, almost forgotten attendance lists, and with them, we're going to piece together this incredible story of how the American deaf community was born. I mean, this is way before the internet, before even telephones. So how did they do it? Let's dig in.
Think about it for a second. How does a community, any community, stay connected when you're spread out over hundreds of miles? Especially back then, with no phones, no internet, nothing. This was the huge challenge facing deaf Americans in the early 1800s. You're scattered all over the place. How on earth do you build a culture, a community, when you're so far apart?
Okay, so the first piece of the puzzle, the first big breakthrough really, was the creation of residential schools. It all started with the American School for the Deaf, or ASD for short, back in 1817. For the very first time, deaf kids from all over the Northeast were brought together. And they weren't just, learning reading and writing. They were creating something totally new, the foundation of a real, vibrant, signing community.
But then you hit a problem. What happens after graduation? Well, everyone goes home. And home meant being scattered all over again, often back to towns where you might be the only deaf person for miles around. And that's a huge risk, right? The community that was just starting to form could have just dissolved.
And this is where our clues come in. We're talking about two incredible documents. They're attendance registries from these big gatherings in Hartford, one in 1850 and another in 1854. And honestly, they're like a time capsule, a rare peek into a community right as it's coming together. And the sheer scale of that first gathering in 1850, it's honestly mind-blowing for the time. Get this, 210 deaf people traveled to Hartford. That's a huge deal. It was one of the biggest conventions of its kind, and this is really important, it included both men and women from the very beginning.
Now, if you look at where these folks went to school, it gets even more interesting. Yeah, okay, most of them, about 81%, were from the American School for the Deaf, but a solid 15% came all the way from the New York School. So what does that tell you? This wasn't just some local school reunion. No, this was a bigger deal, a cross-regional event that was connecting the two major centers of the deaf world at the time.
And digging into who was there, it's a really diverse crowd. 84 women attended in 1850. That's a big number. And it shows you right away how central they were to building this community. And these weren't a bunch of kids fresh out of school either. On average, they'd been out of school for more than 14 years.
So what was the official reason for this big party? Well, it was to honor the school's founders, Laurent Clerc and Thomas Gallaudet, absolute legends. The attendees even chipped in to buy them these beautiful engraved silver pitchers. But, as we're seeing from the data, there was something much, much bigger going on just below the surface.
Yeah, these lists are way more than just a head count. When you really start to look closely, you can see the social fabric of the entire community. You can see the personal connections being made through marriage, family, all of it.
And marriage was a huge part of that, a really powerful glue. Just look at this number. Of the attendees who were in a deaf-deaf marriage, more than 82% of them had married someone from their own school, ASD. It's so clear. School wasn't just about books. It was the main place you found someone who understood you, who shared your language and your world.
And you can see these gatherings acting like a catalyst for relationships. Let's take Albert Barnard and Rhoda Edson, for example. So they were at ASD at the same time for about a year. Then they both show up at the 1850 gathering, both single. Fast forward 1 year. They're married. And then in 1854, they come back to the next gathering, but this time they're together as a married couple. It's a great little story right there in the data. The age of everyone there tells a story too. The average alum from ASD was over 34 years old. Think about that. These weren't kids. These were adults with jobs, with families. And they were making a real conscious effort to travel, maybe for days, to keep these connections alive, connections they'd made years, even decades before.
Okay, but maybe the most powerful story hidden in these lists is about geography. Seriously? By comparing where people lived when they started school to where they were living in 1850, we can literally watch the deaf community pull itself together on a map.
And here's the absolute key takeaway. Instead of just going back to their small, isolated hometowns after school, a whole bunch of these graduates were making a choice. They were choosing to move to cities, specifically to be closer to other deaf people. So let's look at the before snapshot. When these folks first enrolled in school, they were coming from 141 different towns. They were spread out all over the place, mostly in rural areas, and many of them were probably the only deaf person for miles around. Okay, now look at the after picture in 1850. It's a totally different map. The number of towns they live in has dropped from 141 down to 94. That's a huge consolidation. People were deliberately moving, creating these community hubs in cities like Hartford, Boston, and New York. It was a shift from scattered to connected. And these hubs, they were everything. They were places you could go to find work, to find a partner, to have a social life, all in your own language, in ASL. This is where the whole idea of a deaf community stopped being an idea and became a real, everyday thing. And you know, this didn't just happen randomly. It was driven by leaders in the community. Take a guy named Jonathan Marsh. After he graduated, he ends up moving to Boston and starts a Bible class for deaf people. And that class acted like a social magnet, pulling dozens and dozens of other deaf people into the city. That's how Boston became one of these major hubs. But this big geographic shift wasn't just about social life. It had huge consequences for the language itself. This move into cities directly shaped the future of American Sign Language, of ASL. And this is so important because think about what could have happened. With schools in different cities, you could have easily ended up with totally different regional dialects of sign language, almost like different languages. But that's not what happened. All those things we've been talking about, the marriages, the travel between cities, and especially these big gatherings, they all worked to smooth out the differences. They helped forge one unified American Sign Language.
So the bottom line is, the social network that we can see being built in these old documents was also a linguistic network. It's that simple. By making the choice to come together, to build these hubs, to stay connected, the early American deaf community basically guaranteed they would all continue to share one rich common language. I mean, it's pretty amazing, right? Just from a couple of old lists of names and towns, we can piece together the birth of a community. And it really makes you wonder, what other incredible stories are just sitting out there, hidden in some dusty archive? Stories about how we connect, how we build culture, how we make a language, just waiting for someone to find them.